Jesus Freak here. Now, this is obviously one of my Retro Freak videos. See Super Mario Bros. 3 running in the background. It's actually running on this computer, a 1996 era machine running MS-DOS. Now, I actually have a gamepad hooked up here, but since not all the games I have, not all the software I have knows what to do with the Gravis gamepad. Some of them do. I mean, Commander Keen games have certain versions that support it. Wolfenstein 3D supports it. I do have some emulators. And if a program doesn't know what to do with it, you're limited to 2 buttons. If it does, you're still limited to 4. I think you probably need Windows 95 or so to use the shoulder buttons or select and start. You really need 4 buttons in order to do Nintendo correctly, so you have select and start on the joystick. Anyway, I'm not sure if I mentioned it, probably did. I have the original NES, original Super Nintendo, original Sega Master System. And I have the second model Genesis. And I do have to get a new video cable for the Super because that seems not to have made it to the move. It's the same one Nintendo 64 and the GameCube used, so it shouldn't be hard to find. Anyway, I have a bunch of games for all my systems. I have a few games for my Game Boy, a couple for my Game Gear, which needs to be fixed. I think it's suffering from sick capacitor syndrome. This is a problem that plagues original model Game Gears. And I knew it was faulty when I got it. But I got it for free, so I'm not complaining. I did pay for the Nintendo and for a lot of the games I have. Now, at the time I got most of those games, the market was a seller's market. I don't know if it still is, but at that time, it was like, I was put like $30 a cartridge, just ridiculous, for Nintendo and Super Nintendo games. The Genesis were a little cheaper because, Genesis was the runner-up to the Super. But I guess, people are going to be retroed out eventually, and they're going to put them right back on the market. Maybe I'll get lucky and start finding more games. Again, NES games, Super, Genesis, Master System, Game Boy, any of those I take. And I'm probably going to look into over time buying some that I'm looking for. Now, my NES does have an aftermarket repair, and I knew this when I got it. A friend of mine sold it to me. It had an aftermarket cartridge slot modification. I call it the Death Grip mod. And this is pretty common. The cartridge slots wear out over time, and this was a cheap way to replace it. You replace it with a cheap aftermarket part that has a tighter grip than it's supposed to have. Hence the name Death Grip Mod. And if I understand correctly, these are not as high quality as the actual Nintendo parts. But it works, so... And I'm probably going to want to look into buying gamepads. I have a controller on my NES, and it is the original brick pad, but it feels kind of weird because the buttons are a little too loose. I actually prefer the controllers made for the new NES that came out after the Super. The so-called dog bones that look like the Super Nintendo controllers. These are nice. They feel better in the hand. There are the Japanese versions of shorter cables, the American versions of longer cables. So I'm probably going to look into getting a couple of those. My Super Nintendo controllers, probably getting new ones of those. My Master System's controller is perfectly fine. I have two pads for my Genesis. One of them is finicky, the cable, but still works well enough. And the other is an aftermarket one I bought a few years ago. And since it's barely used, it works perfectly. Now, some people might say, why are you in all these old systems? When I got into them, they weren't old. I just stayed into the same ones and, they got old around me. I mean, I was like 8 years old when I first started playing Nintendo. Now, weird thing, back in the day, I'd usually play, I'd play the original Super Mario Brothers. Most people probably mostly played it on Nintendo. I didn't. I actually played it in the arcade. I didn't realize the arcade version was a little bit different. It's actually a little bit harder. It has some levels that were actually eventually went into the Lost Levels game. Like, World 3-2 is actually one of the Lost Levels. And it's a bit harder than the NES version. But to me, that's the one I grew up with. Rather than the NES one. So I guess, I'm in a bit of a different situation. But if you really want to know where I was first getting into video games, I go to Chuck E. Cheese's now and then and hit the arcade, but that was a ways away. I mean, I went to preschool around there and it was like a couple hours bus ride either way. So we're talking, it's a ways out there, but sometimes I go to the arcade there, like birthdays and such, go to Chuck E. Cheese's, hit the arcade, play like Pac-Man, Pole Position, original Mario Brothers, Donkey Kong Jr. This was the kind of stuff that was current back then. Q*bert. And later, go to the laundromat that because we didn't have a working washer dryer at home. Go to the laundromat and Oswego, no longer there. Most of that plaza's gone except for JCPenney's. Go to the laundromat, there was Super Mario Arcade, I believe there was Mr. Do, there was Ghosts and Goblins, Crystal Castles. Can't remember, I think there was one other game there. But I played them all. I pumped quarters into them. Anytime I saw an arcade, I pumped quarters into it. If I had them. But before that, too, I was into games on that Apple IIc. And that's not really a very good gaming system. It never was. I remember, I was a foster family I was with. We were visiting relatives, and they had a Commodore 64. Played Pitfall 2 on it. I remember getting lost. I had no idea what I was doing because there was nothing like it at the time. Of course, we didn't have it, but there was an Apple II version of Pitfall 2. I mean, in the 80s, in the early 90s, I was a video. I was big on these old video games. They weren't old necessarily. I mean, like I was into Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter when they were new. I got into, Commander Keen 4, Wolfenstein 3D. Those were pretty current when I was into them originally. But it's like, I didn't really start getting into anything new after about 95 because I just didn't have the opportunity anymore. The result is, most of the games I still play are from before 95. It's just, I guess, what you're familiar with. And I still play the same games I grew up on. Jesus freak out.